Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're on Instagram and Discord, links in the description. We're playing Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Kyle's playing Bonny Pall, Clearcutter. It's a Lands Matters Simic deck. He plans to landfall his way to victory. Up next is Chris playing Gonti, Canny, Acquisitor. He plans to steal all sorts of his opponent's cards and use them against them. Matt's playing his favorite commander of the set, Stella Wildcard. He's going to burn down his opponents in this Is It Spellslinger's deck. And lastly, we have Scott playing Vihaan, Goldwaker. It leans into Outlaw Tribal, but focuses on a ton of treasure production. Please subscribe if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram, and stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Kyle starts things off with an impressive start. He has a command tower into a soul ring into an arcane signet. So he is on his way to the races. He passes the turn to Chris, who plays an opulent palace, and says go. Over to Matt. He draws and plays an island as his land before passing to Scott. And Scott found a luxury suite, entering the battlefield untapped, of course, and has a soul ring of his own, trying to keep pace with Kyle as best as he can. On Kyle's turn 2, he draws and then gets even more ramp in the form of a 3 visits. So he goes and finds a forest and puts that onto the battlefield. It's untapped, of course. Afterwards, he has a cultivate as well, so he's swimming in mana production very, very early on in the game. Hopefully the other players can catch up. He found an island, entering the battlefield tapped, and put one to his hand. On Chris's turn 2, he played a command tower as his land, and has to say go over to Matt, who found another island. He then passes the turn to Scott. He plays a land in the form of an untapped blood crypt at the cost of 2 points of life. Then he plays Ingenious Artillerist, so every time he brings artifacts out onto the battlefield, he'll start pinging his opponents. On Kyle's turn, he gets even more ramp in the form of a harrow, so he sacrifices the forest he used to cast it to go and find an island and a forest, untapped, onto the battlefield. Then he plays a forest as his land for turn, before casting his commander, Bonny Pall Clearcutter, on turn 3. When that ET beat, he gets an ox. Its power and toughness will be equal to the lands that he controls. On Chris's turn, he plays an island as his land and casts Baleful Strix, which lets him not only draw a card, but its Death Touch does allow some protection against Kyle's board. On Matt's turn, he plays Storm-Carved Coast, and gets to play his commander, Stella Wildcard. He then passes the turn over to Scott, who draws and plays a Dragon Skull Summit as his land. Afterwards, he casts Big Score, so he'll pitch a card in order to draw 2 cards and generate 2 whole treasure tokens. And with those coming into the battlefield, his Ingenious Artillerist will ping each opponent for 2 points. He finishes resolving those effects by drawing his cards. Then he uses those 2 treasures, as well as his land, to cast his commander, Vihaan Goldwaker. He's aiming to flood the board with his treasures and then use them as 3/3 attackers. On Kyle's turn, he found a Satyr Wayfinder, so if he finds a land within the top 4 cards of his library, he'll get to put that onto the battlefield and the rest into the graveyard. He found a Yava Maya, Cradle of Growth, so all things are forests too. He then moves into combat, attacking Scott and Matt, not wanting to lose one of those attackers to a Baleful Strix. Kyle's commander triggers on the attack, so he brought a Reliquary Tower from the graveyard onto the battlefield, making his ox even bigger. No blocks, so they take their beats. On his second main phase, Kyle casts Dune Chanter, so his lands tap for more lands. On Chris's turn, he played a Drowned Catacomb, and then found a Dark Steel Ingot as well. He sets up for future turns and passes over to Matt. He plays a Faithless Looting, so he'll draw 2 and have to pitch 2, looking for a land that he could play off of that, or at least a playable blue spell so that he can trigger his commander. Sadly, he does not, so he passes to Scott, who plays a Swamp Drop, into a Morbid Opportunist. Afterwards, he'll cast Feign the Broker. Feign gives him some options. He can start playing around with +1/+1 counters and making treasures, and he's a hasty boy thanks to his commander. On Kyle's turn, he plays a Command Beacon, and then found a Kodama's Reach. So he'll go find 2 basics, putting one onto the battlefield, in this case it's an island, and getting a forest to his hand. He then moves into combat, swinging at Scott and Matt once again. On the attack, Bonny triggers, so he gets to draw and potentially place another land onto the battlefield, and he does in the form of an island. So his ox gets bigger. Before blocks, Scott activates Feign, sacrificing his soul ring, allowing him to make an Inkling token, and he'll then use that to block. Matt has no blocks and takes his beats. Morbid Opportunist also triggers, allowing Scott to draw a card. In his second main phase, Kyle plays Oracle of Mol Daya. So moving forward, he'll have his top card revealed, and if it's a land, he could play it. He passes the turn to Chris, who plays a Swamp, and brings out his commander, Gonti, Canny, Acquisitor. He sends his Baleful Strix at Scott, And once that connects, dealing him 1 point of damage, Gonti triggers, exiling the top card of his library. Chris can cast that if he wants. On to Matt's turn, he found a land in the form of a Cascade Bluffs. With that out, he plays Big Score, pitching a card to the bin, generating 2 treasure tokens, as well as drawing 2 cards. He then really wants to generate some value with his commander, so using one of the 2 treasures he just made, he plays a beautiful Shock. This is going to target Kyle's face, just to send a message. And because that was the second spell that Matt cast this turn, Stella triggers, so that card will be exiled and he could play it until the end of his next turn. Using his second treasure, he casts a Preordain. Stella triggers, so he'll then tap Stella in order to copy Preordain, therefore resolving its ability twice. Not that bad. After sculpting his hand into a better position than it was before, he passes the turn to Scott. He plays a Desolate Mire as his land, and then he casts Brina the Demagogue. It's a little bit of a political card, and Brina is an outlaw, so it has haste and vigilance. Scott uses Brina to attack Chris, being that he has the highest life total, so he'll put 2 +1/+1 counters on Brina. After combat, he activates Feign, sacrificing one of those +1 counters in order to make a treasure. Once that treasure is created, it'll trigger his Artillerist, pinging his opponents. He then casts Humble Defector, and because it's a rogue, it's an outlaw. He gets to tap it right away in order to draw 2 cards, and then he sends Humble Defector over to Matt, being that he won't be able to make use of it anytime soon. On Kyle's turn, he draws, reveals an Elvish Rejuvenator on the top of his library, moves into combat, triggering his commander, as well as Scott's Brina. So he'll resolve Brina first, drawing the Elvish Rejuvenator, flipping over the top card. He'll then resolve his commander's ability, drawing another card, and then bringing out a land from his graveyard onto the battlefield. And it's a forest this time, making his Ox even bigger. His opponents take their beats, declaring no blocks. He then casts Guardian Project, enabling even more card draw. So he casts that Elvish Rejuvenator, goes and finds a land from the top 5 cards of his library. Then he'll resolve his Guardian Project afterwards. From among those top 5, he only finds a Terramorphic Expanse, but hey, it's a land. Worst case scenario for Terramorphic Expanse, it enters the battlefield tapped. He reveals a Dryad of the Elysian Grove, and that's what he'll draw thanks to his Guardian Project. Then he'll play Dryad of the Elysian Grove, drawing another card thanks to Guardian Project. The top card of his library is then a land, and because of Oracle, he could play it. So he brings out another land onto the battlefield, a forest. Afterwards, he reveals another land, and because Dryad, he could play that as well. The top card of his library is now a Cyclonic Rift. He sort of licks his chops at that and plays a Scaled Herbalist from his hand, triggering Guardian Project once again and drawing that. Everyone knowing that he has a Psych Rift in his hand is pretty demoralizing, so his opponents start talking about how they're going to bring this giant down. On Chris's turn, he plays a Hinterland Harbor, and then casts Scott's Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Motivated to try and find something to work against Kyle, he plays a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Matt's library, so he'll go and find a card, exile it, and then Chris can play that so long as it remains exiled. He found a Pongify, and he'll use Pongify to bring down the Ox, turning it into a 3/3 ape instead of the enormous thing that it is right now. Knowing that Kyle has a Birds of Paradise on the top of his library, Chris decides to attack Matt and roll the dice on the card that he'll get from dealing damage and triggering his commander. So he exiles a card and then passes the turn over to Matt. He plays a Steam Vents untapped at the cost of 2 life. He then immediately taps his Humble Defector and then draws 2 cards, passing it over to Chris. From among those, he found a Stormkiln Artist, so he brings that bad boy out. And now he's even more motivated to cast instants and sorceries. So he plays a Serum Visions. This will trigger Lotho on Chris's board, as well as Stormkiln Artist and Stella. So Chris loses a life and generates a treasure token. Matt makes a treasure token thanks to Stormkiln, and it gets +1/+0. Matt exiled the top card of his library, and he could play that. Then he resolved his Serum Visions as well. Using the treasure, he then casts Ponder. This will trigger his commander, so once again he'll tap Stella in order to copy Ponder. Stormkiln Artist also triggers, so he gets a treasure from that. He'll then resolve both his copy and his proper Ponder. I think he was looking for some cards to help deal with Kyle, but didn't really find much there. He passes the turn to Scott, who plays a Rogue Passage as his land. Then he plays Bounty Board. This triggers his Artillerist, once again pinging all of his opponents. Afterwards, Scott activates his Feign, the Broker, removing a +1/+1 counter off of Brina in order to make a treasure token. This will once again trigger Artillerist, and then he plays Mahadi, Emporium Master. So now he's motivated to ensure that a creature dies on his turn, that way he can make some treasure tokens and keep his engine running. He moves into combat, his commander triggers, making his 2 treasures into 3/3s. He then swings at each of his opponents, Brina and a treasure at Kyle, a treasure at Chris, and Morbid Opportunist at Matt. Kyle uses his life as a resource, Chris blocks the treasure, and Matt blocks the Morbid Opportunist with his Stormkiln Artist, so they just bounce off each other. Scott then moves into his end step, and Mahadi triggers, giving him a replacement treasure for the one that had died. So again, Artillerist triggers, pinging each of his opponents. On Kyle's turn, you guessed it, he Psych Riffs on Overload. That's the first thing he does, bouncing everything of his opponents back to their hands. Sadness for them. After everyone cleans up their board states, Kyle plays a Rumbleweed. I love that thing. He then gives all of his creatures +3/+3 and Trample. So he moves into combat, swinging at who he deems to be his biggest threats, Scott and Matt, dealing enough damage to both of them to knock them out of the game. This will keep Chris around because Kyle thinks he could deal with him on the next turn. And of course, when Kyle moved into combat, he triggered his commander and resolved that ability as well. With Matt getting knocked out of the game, Chris loses access to the card that he had exiled. Kyle passes the turn back over to Chris. He plays an Oblivion Sower, and it's immediately counterspelled, primarily to send a message, but Chris still gets to resolve its when cast ability, so that's cool. Kyle reveals the top 4 cards of his library, and Chris could get a land, but he whiffs, so Chris feels great about all this. Chris moves into end step and has to discard. He pitches Gonti to the bin, which goes to the command zone. On Kyle's turn, he draws and immediately moves into combat, swinging everything he has at Chris, which is definitely enough to knock him out of the game. Congratulations, Kyle. Job well done. You had an explosive start that really catapulted you into the lead of this game. And as promised, here's Meatball. He's so chunky. Well, there you have it. That's the game. Let us know what you thought about this game in the comments. A little bit of a runaway for Kyle, but that's okay. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thanks for watching.